Okay, great.
Yeah, just a second.
So Stephen, you're just setting up the YouTube, is it?
Yes. Hello and welcome all once again to the fourth session of the series titled Writing the Ocean, Ocean as Method, Conversations. These conversations are being pursued under the aegis of MHRD-supported Spark project, Cosmopolitan Cultures and Oceanic Thought, Thinking Through History Across the Waters. As part of the series, we have hosted conversations with Alvin Pang, Yuvono Adhiambo Awor, Amitabh and MG Vasanji. All these conversations are available on the YouTube channel. We have with us today Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah, who will be shortly introduced by the chairs. It is always a delight to open these sessions and introduce our extraordinary chairs. Professor Nishat Zaidi is the professor and head of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the Indian PI for the project. And Professor Dilip Menon is the director of Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and the international PI on this project. Over to you, Professor Nishat Zaidi and Professor Dilip Menon.
Thank you, Stephen, for this opening. It's always a pleasure to meet again for these sessions, which have become a kind of routine for us and also something that we look forward to. Thank you, Professor Gurnah. I can't thank you enough for being so generous in all your communications with us. Now to introduce you, Abdulrazak Gurnah has been called or can be called is a Zanzibari writer, an East African writer, an African writer, a writer who writes about Indian Ocean worlds, and also as a British writer addressing issues of displacement, migration, memory, resettlement, and so on. Gurnah was born in Zanzibar in 1948. In 1968, under the aftermath of Zanzibari revolution, he was forced to run away to Britain. Due to his Yemeni Kenyan heritage, he had to leave Zanzibar because he was not considered African enough. But the place he migrated to was no paradise either. Ironically, his arrival in the UK in late 60s coincided with a raging campaign against immigration. Following postgraduate studies at the universities of London and Kent, he spent 2 years lecturing at Bayero University in Nigeria before returning to teach at Kent, where he is presently Professor of English and Post-Colonial Studies. He has published extensively on colonial and post-colonial writings, including articles on V.S. Naipaul, Willis Oinka. He is the editor of 2 volumes of essays on African writings and the Cambridge Companion to Salman Rushdie. But most importantly, Abdulrazak Gurnah has earned his fame as a leading contemporary novelist. In Writing and Place, Gurnah describes how he stumbled into writing in his early 20s out of his experience in post-war Britain of imperialism, dislocation, the realities of our times. His first novel, Memory of Departure, was published in 1987. And ever since, Gurnah has published 10 novels, all of them, quite an experience to read. So I would encourage my students, many of the audience today, many of them are my students. I would encourage them to read Gurnah's fiction if they haven't read it already. After Memory of Departure in 87, he published Pilgrim's Way in 88, Dottie in 90, Paradise in 1994, and Paradise was shortlisted for both Booker and Whitebeard Prize. Admiring Silence in 96, By the Sea 2001, which again was longlisted for Booker Prize and shortlisted for Los Angeles Times Book Award, and winner of Radio France International Prize. Desertion came in 2005, The Last Gift 2011, Gravel Heart 2017, and fascinating book Afterlives in 2020. He has also published short story, My Mother Lived on a Farm in Africa. The writings of Gurnah are dominated by issues of identity, displacement, and how these things are shaped by legacies of colonialism and slavery. The locations of his fiction, keeps shifting, but it is also connected from pre-colonial Indian Ocean world and Swahili coast in Paradise and Desertion to the time of German colonization in Paradise, British colonization in By the Sea, Admiring Silence and Desertion, post-independence nationalist Zanzibar, which is presented in Memory of Departure, Admiring Silence, Desertion, and By the Sea. Then Doughty, Pilgrim's Way, and The Last Gift, they shift focus to life in Britain, life of migrants in Britain. So these are then there are also novels where the settings traverse both Africa and Europe, for example, By the Sea, Admiring Silence, and Desertion. So Gurnah's fiction, as a critic has observed, involves moving words or worlds across cultures and transporting the imagination beyond the maps of narrowly defined borders. Thank you, Professor Gurnah. I keep calling you Professor. I'll get used to calling you Abdulrazak Gurnah. Both Dilip and I have been reading your novels with great curiosity and admiration ever since we decided to have you, in this talk. So I'll begin, by asking you about migration and movement, which is, of course, one of the central themes that your novels engage with. In By the Sea, you write that travelers and traders who come with their goods and their God and their way of looking at the world, their hungers and greed. And when they leave some among their numbers behind for a whole lifetimes, taking what they could buy, trade, or snatch away with them. So one may say about your characters that, they are once a migrant, always a migrant. Your novels are filled with people who forever yearn and long for a comfortable place which they can call home. Do you think that oceanic movements have caused violence and displacement more than anything else and are directly responsible for the cultures of violence, as one gets to feel through your writings? Unlike writers like Amitav Ghosh, where medieval Indian Ocean movement is kind of celebrated as against the colonial, interventions. In your novels, you have related medieval Indian Ocean migration to colonial and post-colonial migrations in ways that are not necessarily celebratory. So would you agree to this? How do you see oceanic movements impacting the lives of littoral societies and the world at large?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for obviously having done your homework so thoroughly. We're thinking about the Indian Ocean. I don't know if you can generalize that, say, for example, of other places, but probably you can. But certainly for the Indian Ocean, there is a great benefit in that oceanic interchange for the littorals of the Indian Ocean, all the way around, if you like. People traveled from Malaya to Madagascar, Arabs traveled all the way down to the Cape, Indians traveled all the way up and down in the Red Sea, and so on. And of course, Amitav Ghosh's book, In an Antique Land, shows that these links were not only ancient, but continued and prospered right throughout till, I suppose, the appearance of the Europeans in the Indian Ocean, with a different kind of attitude to these exchanges. An attitude of monopolistic trade, an attitude of territorial conquest, and so on, which was not of any interest to many of these littoral cultures. There's a wonderful example, which I'm sure you all know about, of the great armada from China, which came all the way to the coast of Africa. In fact, even today, you can still find shards of pottery, of that particular form of pottery that they brought with them. And then they turned around and went back. Well, you couldn't imagine the Portuguese or the British or the Dutch doing that. They went back because for them, China was a much more interesting place than the coast of East Africa. So off they went. So I think these different attitudes then disrupted what may have been largely, I think, although one mustn't sort of be nostalgic and silly about this, but probably largely a mercantile sort of exchange, an exchange of trade, or perhaps not all of it equal, and so on, to something quite different, something that involved warfare, that involved monopoly, control, and so on, and also territorial domination. And I think this change is where the violence that you speak of, Nishat, really kind of becomes inescapable, becomes the reality of that Indian Ocean business. And things change then. One of the things, of course, that particularly the Gulf Arabs wanted from East Africa was slaves. So that old trade in human beings, of kidnapping people and taking them back, was always going on in that part of Africa, and indeed elsewhere, other parts of Africa, in the Mediterranean. That is to say, slaves wanted in the Mediterranean, slaves wanted in India, slaves wanted in the Gulf, and poor old Africa was always where they came to get them. Mind you, they got them elsewhere as well, but it was really the expansion of European plantation trade system, rather, in the Indian Ocean, these islands that became plantations in themselves, Mauritius, Reunion, to some extent the Comoros, and of course South Africa, that suddenly required huge numbers of people. And so then you get this explosion of even greater violence, which takes place in the 19th century, which becomes the slave trade. So these violences are probably that I write about and that you mentioned, something that reaches a kind of climax with the intervention of Europeans. I'm not saying it's their fault. I'm saying a kind of climax arrives in the 18th and 19th century. And I suppose in a way, colonialism transformed everything. Well, it transformed everything everywhere, but it certainly transformed everything in that part of the world. And we're still living through its consequences, one way or another. I mean, one way or another, culturally, territorially, politically, and so on, all of these things. So I don't think I'm interested in the violence of ocean travel. I'm saying that, sure, it's great to celebrate it, and I do celebrate Amitav Ghosh's work, or even Basanji's work, when they see a certain kind of benefit and celebration in the way that those displaced people somehow or the other came through. So when you think of Amitav Ghosh, where he writes about how the Indian people taken to Mauritius, say how they somehow or the other come through, and so on, to China and so on. Well, that's great. But, and I do admire that. He writes these these very, very moving, powerful stories. But there is another thing that happened to us, to East Africa, which is a disruption of a whole history and a whole culture. The expulsion, one way or another, whether it's by force or by various other means, denial of, say, being able to make a living or whatever it might be. And people, Indian people, other people were left. And so a culture kind of more or less disappeared, although I'm saying more or less because I think it's coming back. I think there is a kind of revival going on. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
Actually, may I just pick up on two things that you said? You mentioned, the Chinese Armada under the eunuch Admiral Zheng He, which makes its way to Africa. And our first author that we interviewed, Yvonne Auer, her novel, The Dragonfly Sea, actually deals with the descendants of the Chinese admiral. And it takes up the contemporary period where China is reforging those connections. And bringing up the idea of Admiral Zheng He all over again. The other thing that was interesting that you said was about the introduction of a certain kind of structural violence on the ocean. I mean, the ocean was never a pacifist space. There were pirates, buccaneers, and so on. But there's structural violence introduced by the Europeans, and that has left a lasting legacy on lives, on families, and so on, So in one sense, when one reads Amitav Ghosh and your novels together, there is a kind of a more composite picture that arises of the ocean, of the possibilities as well as the constraints. But just thinking about your novels, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, having read your novel over a longer period and then read them in a concentrated way for the interview, migration seems to leave a scar that never heals, really. Your characters migrate to leave squalor, secrets, a deep violence behind, but they carry their wound inside them. So Hannah in The Last Gift tells her mother in a rather cruel fashion, in a burst of rage, says, these vile immigrant tragedies, right? And which is a kind of very scarring sentence in the book. And the migrants remain suspended within their own lives. They're unable to belong, unable to love. They're incapable of love, seemingly, or of the trust that is needed to love. So it's very dystopian in that sense. Of course, it might be that I'm reading this very differently from the way you intended when you wrote it. But there's something about the idea of what migration does to the psyche. There seems to be no escape, no redemption. This is related somehow to the fact that when you left Zanzibar and you went to England, it was out of the frying pan into the fire, into the rhetoric of Enoch Powell and so on. But this question of this migration as a scar that you carry, right, is something that I find very disturbing within your novel.
Well, I'm not sure if I would completely agree that, well, for a start, yes, I think migration, particularly if it's not to a community. In other words, if a whole family migrates, you can imagine that they would all go through various tragedies and unhappinesses, but there would be a family and there would be a kind of network of support. Or alternatively, where people might migrate into a community, by which I mean that you go from Zanzibar to, I don't know, to Paris, and there's already a small community of Zanzibaris living there, and you get drawn into that, and therefore you learn the ropes of being a foreigner and a stranger with the help and the support of others. And perhaps age matters as well. That if you're a certain age, you're able to cope with difficulties in a different way. You have more experience. You're prepared. I think all of these things may have contributed to the problematic way I encountered England, because we didn't go, and my brother and I left together, and we didn't go into a community. We went to a small southern England town where there was nobody like us, and lived through various difficulties of the time and so on. But I'm not trying to make too much of that. What I'm saying is that these may all have contributed to my sense of that there is a tragic dimension to migration. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, especially now when you see so many young people, young men mostly, taking these terrible risks to arrive here and or somewhere like here, and have to do really quite horrible, menial, terrible jobs, or even no jobs at all, or even you just get detained, or even that everything about the experience must be painful. So in the first instance, I wanted to write about that, that sort of problematic dimension of migration. Migration is not just simply exchanging one thing for another, because there's also all the stuff in your head that you can't do anything about. Your experience, your desertions, your guilts, your whatever. But where I don't agree with you is that, in fact, there is no redemption. Because if that were the case, then people I write about would end up committing suicide or something. But they don't. They struggle through, and they make something out of that experience. And very often, I try to leave a hint or two that maybe there's something about to happen in the future, as it were, either a new relationship or a new way of thinking about, if you remember, for example, like in The Last Gift, the brother and sister are saying, shall we go to Zanzibar? Oh no, don't be stupid. So we don't know whether they will or not, but it's just an idea like that left behind that they've seen a way out of what they had thought was an impasse. So that's probably where I would say that's the best I can do.
True.
Can't give you all a happy life, but I can say, well, there's maybe just a possibility that you can work something out of this.
Yeah, that something may happen outside of this book, like the
That's
chance
right,
encounter on a plane, which could lead to a relationship and so on.
That's right.
Yes, yes. Actually, Dilip mentioned scar, and you talked about pain. So I really like, the way your novels, I mean, almost all novels, you speak of how forces of history impact the lives of ordinary people. People who do not have control on those forces. Their lives are impacted by these larger forces of history. And Dilip also talked about, reading your novel alongside Amitabh Ghosh's novel. In fact, I happened to read your novel alongside Vasanji's novel. So I read Desertion immediately after the gunny sack. And after that, I shared with Dilip that I felt as though I'm familiar with that entire neighborhood. It looks like you know all the neighbors. So, so my question is actually about the cosmopolitan, dispositions of littoral society that you present in your work. But this cosmopolitanism is also, posited as a threat to what is presented as ways of being African. So how does engagement with coastal lives complicate understanding of nationalist politics? And when I say engagement with coastal lives, I'm thinking of coastal lives as a kind of, a hinge between land and sea, between interior and exterior, between pull of the past and acknowledgement of the present. So on the one hand, in novels like, Paradise and Afterlives, you focus on violent coercion embedded in public moral gestures of, imperialism. And then, also to some extent, collusion of Christianity in all this. But in Memory of Departure, you have described a heady atmosphere of intrigue and politics and revenge that the independent government had brought. So nationalist politics, it has denied the intricate negotiations and entanglements embedded in littoral societies. Do you agree to this? How, in your view, have processes of decolonization impacted the cosmopolitan moorings of coastal societies?
Sure, yeah. Well, I would say it's not, I'll go a little bit, maybe a step back and say that it's colonialism, the establishment of colonial territories is the first break, if you like, the first pressure on that littoral culture. Think of it like this. If you think of East Africa, say, all the way from southern Somalia to northern Mozambique, as it is now, all of those people speak Swahili, or used to anyway. That would be their language. Almost all of them are Muslims. They're probably related in one way or another. But that community or that culture didn't go much further than about, say, 30, 40 miles into the interior. And that's the end of it. In the case of Mombasa is an island. The people on the other side of the creek were called Mijikenda, people across the creek. They weren't us. So it was only a very narrow strip of course. So what does colonialism do? They come, they draw their maps. They don't want little strips of that. They want all of that land behind there. So that, if you like, that unified culture is now suddenly Kenya, Tanganyika, Mozambique, etc. And it includes all these people in the interior, millions of them, who have nothing to do with that coastal culture. And so for the next, whatever, I mean, colonialism in that part of the world wasn't very old. Kenya only became a colony in about 1903 or 4, something like that. So it was only about 60 years or so of colonialism, unlike you guys, of course, who have hundreds of years of colonialism. In the case of Zanzibar, it was 1896 when it became a territory. It's a very short period when all this happens. But the result of it was that when we come to decolonization, what you have is a very tiny minority of these coastal people and a huge majority of people who don't share anything with them, religion, culture, language, etc. And so it was really inevitable, once those maps had been drawn, that sooner or later, those coastal cultures are going to have to lose their whatever uniqueness they have. And that indeed is what has happened. Zanzibar is different because it was actually an island. And although there was quite a lot of migration of labor from the mainland, which is essentially part of the explanation for the revolution when it came to it, it wasn't in the same top-heavy way, which is that, say, Kenya experienced decolonization, where the coastal culture has more or less gone as a force. In the case of Zanzibar, it was just somehow incomprehensible that so much violence attended the revolution. It was well, incomprehensible. It was difficult even now, every day when I think about it. I can't get over that. Why was it necessary? You know, my conviction is that, in fact, the party, the Afro-Shirazi party, the party that carried out the revolution, would sooner or later have won the elections anyway, possibly the next election.
Right.
So it's difficult to understand why it became necessary to do that. So I think some kind of madness took place, and this is part of the racialization of politics during the decolonization period. So as the country comes towards independence, it's already split, polarized between people who speak of themselves as Africans and people who speak of themselves as nationalists. That is to say, open to all kind of mixture of people. So by the time independence comes and the British clear off, it seems that polarization and that racial polarization turns into violence. And one side won, the other side lost. And there's no mercy in that sort of situation.
Yeah.
So although it appears, and I know I write about this basically from the experience of Zanzibar rather than say the experience of Kenya, where the violence actually is even worse between the Luo and the Kikuyu people, for example, rather than the violence which they do, rather than the violence they practice on, say, coastal people, because they've utterly dominated them. There's no point there anymore. And of course, Uganda has its own internal kind of warring and violence between themselves. So I'm not writing so much about that, but because I don't know very much about it in the sense of an experienced way. But I do know very much about how petty a state can become in its exercise of authority.
Right. Actually, there's something very profound about this as well, in that decolonization has been accompanied by violence in almost all parts of the world. You think about India, the partition, think about Burma, think about Malaya. And in that sense, Zanzibar is also part of that larger history where under colonialism, there was just the relation of groups to the colonial power, but very few horizontal relationships that built up. It's like, as you say, the thin crust on the coast and that vast hinterland, and they're not having much in common, but they're forcibly put together. I mean, that's, but I just want to move away from this big question. We'll come back to this in later, but I want to ask something that's slightly more intimate, in the sense that rather like the question that I asked you earlier of the scar of immigration, if one thinks about the family, I mean, the family is generally something that we see as the space of domesticity, a space of refuge, a space of belonging. And one is reminded of Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is different in its own way. And one of the features of this migration, or indeed the histories of indenture, the histories of slavery, is the fact that families are not stable. Right? I mean, they're constantly disrupted, they're made and unmade. There are people who take you in, and that is family. And this comes up quite often in your novels, where the foundling, the person who is a member of a family willy-nilly, has been raised by somebody else. And people come in, people depart. So I was just wondering, how much is experience of migration, both colonial, post-colonial, bears and I'm putting it in a rather sharp fashion, bears this impossibility of reproducing the forms of bourgeois domesticity, right? Most novels are about the family, whereas here it's about families which are very constituted in a very, very transitory fashion.
Yeah. Well, it's a very rich ground to explore, you see, the family, I find. Not particularly because of personal experience. In other words, I have a very happy family myself. So it's not because I have experienced great unhappiness, at least my own immediate family. But I have experienced and have seen how paradoxical, in a way, families can be, both in the sense of that even love can be crushing, but particularly in the way that families are authoritarian. And I say authoritarian not because they kind of swing a stick and commit violence and so on, but authoritarian in the way that they make demands on the individual. I'm interested in how an individual person learns to cope in life. Actually, most of my concerns, I think, are about that figure, that individual, a man or woman, but that figure, how a person copes in circumstances which are menacing. And the menace can come in different forms. It can come in the form of being orphaned, say, and having to grow up in strange circumstances. I mean, in the sense of unloving circumstances, or it can be in the form of dislocation, going to another place. So I often find I return to this figure of somebody who's somehow menaced by circumstances, right, whatever they are, and therefore having to manage. I'm particularly interested in the figure of the child, which seems to me is, as it were, the prime candidate for menacing in this way, or indeed in a culture I'm familiar with, women who are particularly younger women who often find themselves being manipulated into having to make certain decisions, having to I don't mean just marriage, but I mean other things as well. Their worth is almost mercantile. So for all of those reasons, I'm seeing the family as this paradoxical unit, which both supports or is capable of supporting, or capable of giving love. If you think of the last gift, for example, and the way that family operates, but it's also at the same time demanding in another way. And the another dimension of this idea of the family is that, and maybe this is something that is done out of love, again thinking of something like the last gift, but perhaps elsewhere as well, but secrets, the way that parents keep things away from their children in order to save them in some way, to protect them in some way, and how this becomes a problem. So it's done out of love, but it becomes a source of sorrow, a source of things begin to go bad. So it's these ways. I don't have a clear, simple picture of the family. I see the family as a very fertile idea, as it were, to think about, to explore, to go back and forth on.
Nishat, may I just follow up on this? Because if the family is one sentimental trope of bourgeois writing, childhood is another sentimental trope. And to read Departure, which was actually the first novel I read of yours a long, long time back, there is, to be a child is no fun. You are brutally treated to brutal violence by your parent or an authority figure. You're sexually violated by those of your own age or slightly older to you if you're a boy. So so there's something there about disillusioning. Reading your novel, there's a disillusioning of all these sentimental tropes that one finds in literature, and I wondered where that comes from.
Yeah, well, again, I think I would just hesitate to say all, not all.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah,
as you notice, I mean,
there are
I just
some.
put my questions in an extreme fashion.
So I wouldn't say, for example, I see all childhoods as tragic, say, in the way that I write about them. But I am aware that tragedy lurks just around the corner. And so if you think of something like Dottie, say, Dottie grows and she comes through, as you will, but her sister doesn't, and her brother doesn't.
Right.
So I guess I'm not throwing out all possibilities of happiness or whatever. I'm saying that, as I say, every corner has a menace waiting, and so you've got to be alert. You've got to keep your eyes open. You've got to learn. You've got to experience, and that kind of thing. The same thing you might say about the Yusuf figure in Paradise. Yeah, so there's this, there's that, but somehow it comes through in some fashion, unharmed.
Right.
So, I mean, there have been, I know that there are one or two people who have remarked on that fact that this boy somehow survives when you not thought he would. That you would have thought something would happen to him, but he does. So I'm saying this kind of good fortune also happens, as well as the bad luck, as it were, that also happens. So it isn't just sort of individual resourcefulness that makes it possible.
Yeah,
sometimes
good
we're
fortune
just
happens
lucky.
by accident. Right.
Yeah, sometimes we're just lucky.
Right. So, if I may, Dilip, yes?
Yeah, please.
So speaking of families, most families in your novels are practicing Muslims. Not all, but I'm saying most. Most families are practicing Muslims. So the idea of Islam and being Muslim and the problematic of it dominates many of your writings and your practices of word making or world making. So how do you view the role of Islam in the Indian Ocean region in general, and of course, East Africa in particular?
Yeah, well, I think probably it played a very big part in some parts of the Indian Ocean littoral. And I'm thinking, when I say that, I'm thinking obviously of the Arabian, Southern Arabia, Arabian Peninsula, but thinking of the littoral for the moment in Southern Arabia, in Somalia, in East Africa, the Comoros, most of the most learned scholars of Islam in Kiswahili come from the Comoros. So, so sure, it plays a big part. But another very, very big part is that the culture of Islam, so far as it concerned us in East Africa, was not just religion. Yeah. It was also all the various stories that, the fiction, the poetry, the figures like Abu Nuwas. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Abu Nuwas is a kind of trickster figure in the literature of in Arabic literature. You'll see stories of Abu Nuwas in Palestine, in Iraq, but you'll also hear them in Zanzibar. And the same thing for so many of those Alfu Lela Lela story, the Arabian Nights, they're called 1001 Nights. Many of those stories are current, still are current, or certainly current in my childhood in Zanzibar. Various kind of myths that were part of the Islamic world elsewhere were also, kind of part of it. So I see, this is what I'm thinking of as a kind of cosmopolitanism in itself. That is to say, a sort of network of cultural ideas, of myths, of practices, and so on, which are absolutely nothing to do with the globe, as it were, but to do with a limited space. So it seems to me it's the notion of cosmopolitanism as a universal phenomenon is just another Eurocentric notion. That in reality there are cosmopolitanisms which are, located in specific either territorial or cultural spaces. It might be religion, that's the dominant kind of glue, as it were, or cohesive force. or it might be other things. It might be, I don't know, ethnicity or whatever. So when I think of Islam in that way, not just as a religion, but as a kind of connected phenomenon of culture, of language, well, not language, because language is different, but to some extent language, to some extent, in the sense that if you're a Swahili speaker, quite a lot of the vocabulary of Swahili comes from Arabic, from Hindi, and possibly a little bit from the European languages, but largely from Bantu, Arabic, and Hindi. And the words don't just come on their own. You know, the words come with a certain kind of inflection and meaning and probably presence. That is to say, there are probably Hindi speakers there in order for Hindi to become part of, or Arabic speakers there for Arabic to become part of whatever. So they bring themselves and the culture and what's valuable to them into our understanding. So yeah, I see it as a complicated, syncretic, cosmopolitan phenomenon, Islam. But, you know, if you're standing in another place, if you're standing in, let's say, I don't know, in Kerala, you might have a different emphasis, although I suspect there will be some overlap. I think a lot of it for the Indian Ocean is to do with the ocean, is to do with those monsoon winds, those winds that bring people and take them back, And Kerala, of course, experiences it from a different angle, but it's still the monsoons which take you all the way across to Indonesia and all this kind of thing.
I think it's wonderful that you should bring up the idea of cosmopolitanisms, because that's really, if one were to put, it's a growth industry in historical scholarship right now. There are many works that are coming up on Indian Ocean Islam. This is a magisterial book by this Malay historian, Eng Seng Ho, on the Yemeni, the Hadramauti diaspora, which moves all the way from Yemen through to Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. There's Ronit Ritchie's work on, speaks about the Arab cosmopolis between India and the Western Indian Ocean. So I think, you know, for historians to be able to capture the texture of lives, one has to resort to reading imaginative works such as yours, because historical archives yield only so much. But the bigger question that, to go back to something that I'd asked you earlier, and as you realize now by the questions that I'm asking you, I tend to ask questions in a slightly more exaggerated fashion than they need.
That's fine. I can cope with that.
Okay. Now, there is there's a kind of Fanonian rage in your novels, I think, about the betrayals of the post-colonial elite, the state. So in Admiring Silence, for example, the protagonist makes up these absurdly exaggerated stories for his wife's parents of the benefits of colonial rule. And then these stories are measured up against the reality of the corruption, the dirt. I mean, dirty toilets and the lack of sanitation as a potent metaphor there in the post-colonial situation. It's also there in very well in By the Sea. The idea of return back for the migrant is, in some sense, reminded me a lot of Naipaul. It's tinged with disgust, a sense of an unbridgeable distance. And so again, to pose the question in a kind of exaggerated manner, is it impossible for the migrant to return, regardless of the privations that they may suffer, a lack of a sense of belonging, racism, and so on? But emotionally and physically, can they return to these lands that they migrated to? Because the post-colony does seem to be the ultimate dystopia. It's where corruption happens. There is it's like idealism gone awry. And in that sense, I mean, just as we spoke of Amitav Ghosh and your work, in the way you talk about the post-colony, I'm reminded very strongly about Naipaul's sense of disillusionment with India as well.
No, I don't think so. I don't think I share the sort of contemptuous disregard that Naipaul had for almost everything he wrote about, except England and just now and then the United States. I think what I'm writing about in those two examples in Admiring Silence, for example, is to say that this experience of migration has so completely transformed him. Right. And all of that struggling and lying, and I'm seeing the lying as an inevitable consequence of being isolated, of being lonely, and so when he encounters the woman who becomes his partner, he starts to tell her things which are not exactly true, but are close to the truth and reflect well on him. So that kind of lying is, I think, probably easy to fall into if there's no one there to contradict you. Why would you tell bad stories about yourself? Tell nice stories about yourself. The stories he tells to the parents, it's obviously to mock them, I thought, to make fun of them, because he's already learned from his partner that they are very conservative people, that they have certain ideas, and so he's giving them what he thinks they want, and at the same time he's laughing at them. So this is the idea. So then, while all this looks like somehow managing, coping, there is another experience, another reality, as it were, that he's not facing. So when he returns, so this is why that experience is so shattering, when he returns, he's already forgotten a great deal of what living there is like. And so it becomes that he has to learn again just how difficult it is to live under those circumstances. I don't actually exaggerate very much about the reality that he encounters when he goes back, because in some ways it's sort of it's not too far from my experience in metaphorical terms. That is to say, I couldn't go back to Zanzibar for 17 years after having left, because I had left illegally. So going back would have meant that I had broken the law, and probably didn't know what's the consequence of that, but I wasn't about to take the risk of finding out. Anyway, so in 1984, there was a change of government. I mean, not a big change, just the top man was removed and another man came in. And he not only let out many of the political prisoners that were in Nyerere's jails in those years, but he also said an amnesty on all of those people like me who had left without proper authorization. So I went back, but by then it was 17 years had passed. I had married, had 2 children. I was working in London and all this kind of thing. For me, when I went there, I was terrified of what I would see. I was terrified that what I suspected might be a rejection. Who are you? Where have you been? Excuse me. You're not one of us, etc., etc. So I was terrified of rejection in this way. But I was also terrified of my own sense of guilt, I suppose, because I knew how hard it had been. But what I didn't expect were the blocked toilets. So that's no exaggeration. I did not expect the depths, if you like, of difficulties that people were having to live with. Not only the blocked toilets, but shortages. I knew about, the authoritarian security forces and so on, the petty state, all of these things. So that's what I wrote about. Pretty soon after that, and this becomes another topic that I raised in, say, in something like Gravel Heart. Pretty soon after that, as part of the same kind of thing that this new leadership was doing, was a liberalization of the economy. And that brought in another big change: tourists. Suddenly, because foreign exchange was available, tourists started to come. Now, you can't have blocked toilets and tourists. So tourism then began to make a difference in order to make it possible for these people to come with their money and have fun there on our little beaches. And so that then, while it brings a lot of other problems, of course, that then allowed a certain kind of improvement to take place. And you see that in the way that I write about that in Gravel Huts, that things are getting on. But what is happening to the figures that I'm writing about is that they have become transformed by their experience. And it no longer is possible for them to say, here I am, I'm back, I'm home, because other things have happened to them. And it's just not possible anymore to leave all those problems in England now behind and say, okay, I'm now home, because where is home now? This is the confusion that comes out of that experience, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, in India, I suppose we solved the problem of blocked toilets by defecating in the open, which is what annoyed Naipaul so much.
Well, you have the land space to do that, you see, but on a little island.
Okay. My next question takes us to your writing practices, Gurnah. Literary writings do not only represent literal interconnections, but they themselves constitute a passage between South Asia, East Africa, Europe, North America. So, I'm thinking of, for example, in Afterlives, if we take example of Afterlives, it takes a while for the novel to settle its center of gravity. Everyone has a story and we really don't know who is in the foreground, which one is the background, and so on. Similarly, we find a lot of intertextuality in your writings. Paradise has been said to be a reversal or revision of Heart of Darkness. Gravel Heart you mentioned, which takes its title from Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. So, as a writer, engaged with historical and cultural experiences of Western Indian Ocean coast, how much of an agential role do you think does Indian Ocean play in altering notions of self-identity that we have? So, to what extent do you think the paradigm of oceanic circulation of water inform the structure of writing itself? So how does novel replicate this structure of oceanic thinking?
That would be a difficult one. I'm not sure that. I use metaphors of the ocean regularly. Like I mentioned about the monsoons, that appears in almost half the books that I've written. And the meaning of that, not just simply the phenomenon of it, but the meaning of it, and the way that it becomes a source of so much, both goods and whatever, as well as people, as well as stories, etc. I don't know. I do quite like it. I think in By the Sea, I do make more of the ocean than say elsewhere, because I describe the stories around it, but I'm not sure if I would go as far as saying that it's structural. That there is an oceanic structure in what I write. I don't know. I'll leave that to you.
Leave some work for the academics.
Yeah, well, sure.
And before this, we had Vasanji, who said that is the reason why academics are not good novelists. So you are at least an example of someone who can defy that. You are an academic and also a good novelist.
Yeah. So actually, this is another question, which I'm trying to ask the big themes, as it were, things like
sure.
migration, slavery, race, and so on. So, one of the things, but this is just to follow on from what Nishat asked about how the ocean may create its own forms of narration. How do you engage with those kinds of narratological practices and so on? But so in your novels, there's a map of movement, right, of people created by colonial connections, trade, labor, and so on. And I feel, and I may be wrong here, as I have been in the previous three questions.
No, you haven't been wrong. Just nuancing your question.
Yeah, I know. So there never really is a spirit of adventure, only necessity, that people travel across the ocean because it's necessary for them to do so. And so this idea of adventure, which is kind of central to Amitav Ghosh, where the sea becomes a space where you cast aside these surly bonds of the earth, as it were. So I think there's a kind of difference there. But that's one question. The other one, which is connected, is that it's about afterlives, which is really one of my favorite novels of yours, for the sheer richness of the writing. And there's an engagement with colonialism itself, the recruitment of Askaris to fight in the First World War. There's also that relation between Hamza and the German Oberleutnant, which is like a parable of relation between the races, because the Oberleutnant would like to get Hamza to read Schiller, for example, and as part of the civilizing mission. Yet all of this goes nowhere. And in some senses, it appears to be a kind of fault line in your novels, that despite the possibility of relations, however fraught, between brown and black with the white, there is a lack of synchrony somewhere, whether in love or the possibility of friendship. And amidst the fluidity of the ocean, the hardness of race seems to remain. So how would you nuance that?
Well, because it's an unequal relationship. That's why. I mean, at least the ones that I do write about. I mean, I don't think I've written about friends, although I'm not saying it's not possible for people of different races to be friends. But because the particular terrain that I cover, say, in Afterlives, it's actually not possible for that relationship to be anything other than domineering on one hand, and perhaps confused and slightly apprehensive on the other. But I think that the kind of the more powerful idea I was interested in is that not only Germans, but Europeans, as they come to Africa, come already with an ideological mindset about who they're coming to, who are these people, and who they are in relation to them. And of course, racial superiority, cultural superiority, almost a sort of entitlement to be to rule over them, to order them to do whatever. And so this explains the violence, it explains the condescension, the patronizing, and so on. But on the other hand, they're still human. They're still human for all of that. So there will be times, or there will be occasions, when this other side will make it more difficult for them to just live by ideology, if you like. So I wanted the officer to be an example of something like this, and that for whatever reason he chooses, is struck by Hamza. Some connection happens, which brings out something that he perhaps doesn't even understand himself, and certainly does not acknowledge. Now, it could be that what it brings out is affection, it could be desire, it could be a memory, something like he explains it to himself by saying, I had a brother. But that may not be the proper explanation. That may be just his way of kind of coping with something that is, troubling, or that is that he cannot acknowledge. So that's what I wanted to do with that relationship, really. It's not so much to say it's not possible because races cannot be. I'm saying that something human comes out of the officer, but he doesn't know how to deal with it because of that, what he comes with, what he's already got in his head about. And the pastor puts it into words and says that perhaps what created the problem with the Feldwebel is a sense that he was somehow diminishing the prestige of being German by showing so much solicitude and affection for you. So that's what I was trying to get at. There is, of course, a relationship between the Frau Pastor and Hamza, which is quite proper and human.
But to go back to the beginning, where Nishat spoke about your move from Zanzibar to Britain, and at a time when Britain was really dealing with the detritus of imperial memory and racism was surfacing and so on. So if one were talking about a contemporary period, where the power relations are still there. I mean, it's not as if one moves as an immigrant to a society where you're empowered in any meaningful sense, apart from a general rhetoric about multiculturalism and so on and so forth. So if one were to talk about the contemporary experience of the immigrant, I mean, how would you write about it in terms of race? Because in your novels, there are relationships between the recent immigrant and white women, and they falter. There's something that happens which doesn't allow them to mesh together for whatever reason. So I just wondered how race plays a role for the contemporary period as well.
It doesn't always end in disaster. I mean, I suppose you would say, if you're thinking of something like Admiring Silence, that it's a consequence. The reason that cannot flourish really fully, that relation, is because it's based on falsehoods. Right. That there are so many sort of self-serving constructions, as it were, in the way that the narrator delivers himself. That unless at some point, by which time is too late, when he comes back, you imagine that he would have come back with certain kinds of ideas clarified for him, and that he would have wanted to say to his partner, this is what it's really like, this is how it is. And so, but of course he comes back and he's missed the boat because she's already in another relationship with somebody else. That's just life. I'm not saying it's not possible, but that's just how things go. He's unlucky. So I don't think I'm saying that it's not it's inconceivable that these things can take place. I very often find creating a little glitch or a little problem for relationships is not only kind of like realistic, but in a way it's part of the expression of being a stranger, in a way, that you're vulnerable to to misunderstanding, you're vulnerable to misjudgments. And so I guess, I mean, I guess I'm saying that you're lucky if things work out. Something like that. Although, I mean, things have worked out for me, so I'm not saying it's not possible. And also, it's not
no doubt about that.
No, I mean, in terms of personal relationships.
Yeah, and working out also in terms of your writing technique, your style. I mean, you successfully managed to communicate what you wanted to communicate. Right. Yeah. So, in fact, my last question, Dilip, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So my last question is also linked again to your writing practice. Glissant suggests that Creole language contributes another internal necessity. And he says that necessity is the obligation to remake oneself every time on the basis of a series of forgettings. So language and memory play a central role in your novels also. My question to you is, can narratives recuperate those series of forgettings? Because, I mean, we are talking about impact of colonialism. What are the afterlives of African perspective, in the archive of world history? how can it be salvaged when one of the impact of colonialism has been a deliberate exclusion of African perspective? And you also have spoken about it, in your interviews. So can literary writings recuperate such lost archives? That is my question to you. And of course, it is linked to linguistic and stylistic choices that you make. What kind of stylistic and linguistic choices you make to represent the movement of people, ideas, goods across the Indian Ocean and the Eastern African region, or the Swahili society, or even beyond it? Would you reflect on your own writing practice for us?
Sure, you do ask Diego questions. I think it is possible to open a space, as it were, for people to think again about things they think they know. Or in some cases, like with Afterlives, for example, it may be that people only have a vague notion of this historical moment. More, I mean, people in Tanzania and Zanzibar and possibly other parts of East Africa do, of course, know about this historical moment. But I also want to say there's a lot that you don't know, let alone for, say, people like in the UK or India, I don't know, who might know something but not enough. So in that space, that's what I mean when I say open space. So it's not that you're telling people things they know nothing about, although that may be the case now and then. Maybe with Paradise, it might have been a way of thinking about that time that many people would not have considered. But in any case, both there and with something like Afterlives, and perhaps some of the other books as well, is to say, here's a way of opening up that understanding, think some more about it. And so in this respect, I don't think it matters who the reader is. Of course, sometimes you do get, or I do get, because these days with email, there's no escape. I do get an email from somebody who says, I know what you're talking about. It's such and such and such and such and such, isn't it? Like in the case of, let's say, the figure of Ilyas in Afterlives. Within days of the book's publication, I get an email from a historian in Israel, actually, who says, I know you're talking about Bayume, aren't you? And there is indeed a historical figure who forms, the basis of this. Not the fictionalized life in East Africa, but the outcome in Germany. But for a lot of people, it will be, I think, quite a surprising outcome. That's what? There was a recolonization movement as part of the Nazi platform. Many people probably wouldn't know that. So in this way, it's not so much telling, instructing, but it's a way of saying, think again. There are dimensions of this that, are worth reflecting on, including, of course, the horror of the actual experience, the casualties, the deaths, the disruptions, and so on.
Right. That inspires me to ask a question which was asked to Amitabh Ghosh by some audience, someone in the audience. Is writing therapeutic for you?
Therapeutic.
Is writing therapeutic for you? Yeah.
No, not anymore. I guess that's how it began for me. Look, and I say I stumbled into writing and quoted that thing. What I meant was when I started to write, it was necessary to do it at the time, as a way of trying to understand what was going on, trying to remember, what I left behind, that kind of thing. But no, by this time, it's work.
Actually, it's interesting.
But it's a work and pleasure. Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting that you responded in that fashion, because at some point in the conversation with Amitabh Ghosh too, we asked this question and he said, no, it's not therapeutic, which made, I must say, I had a warm glow in my heart that I'm glad I chose to be an academic, which I do see as very therapeutic considering the changes that are happening in India. But a final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Otherwise, Nishat and I will chew your ear forever, because one of the things about reading somebody's novels is that you think you know them very well, right? And so we're speaking to you like a very dear friend whom we are catching up with. So, one of the things, to go back to the oceanic question that Nishat had raised, when we speak about the ocean, we are constantly in this world of vastness, circulation, a space beyond the narrow provincialisms of land and so on. So what does it mean for you to be from Zanzibar and now in England, an act of island hopping, as it were, from one small island to another small island? So do you, like Abbas says in The Last Gift, he says that people cannot understand how, and I quote, how tiny the place he came was from, how tiny their lives felt there. He was frightened of the world. That was what he was frightened of. And so when we think and write with the ocean, there is also this sense of terror before its vastness, the fact of coming from small places. How does it change the way in which you think about the world, relate to the world, write about the world, and so on?
Yes, I think it probably does play a big part. I have this sense of coming from a small place all the time. And it was certainly the experience of arriving in England. You're saying from one small island to another. It didn't seem like that to me at all. I was coming from a small island, all right, but I wasn't coming to a small island. I was, sorry, from a small island, but it didn't feel to me when I came to England that I was coming to a small place. It seemed huge to me. It seemed an enormous and rather scary place to be. So much to know, and so on, how to sort things out. So I guess in many, many ways, it's not an experience I've left behind. I still have this sense. And then I lived most of my life in Canterbury, which is a small town. So I do have a sense of living in small places, and I quite like it. I only lived in London briefly for about 3 years or so, and I can truthfully say I didn't like it. I found it quite bewildering, quite huge, but many people love that. So I think that coming from a small place is, part of my consciousness, as it were. That's probably why I like Stellenbosch as well. So it's not a problem, but it does give you a way of thinking as well, of course. A way of thinking small, if you like, and thinking that experience is circumscribed. It isn't just sort of like that. But on the other hand, having said I come from a small place and I have a sense of that smallness, but I also have another sense of being part of a big world, like I mentioned earlier to an earlier question about Islam. So I felt, even as I was growing up, and certainly I still feel now, that I'm connected to various places around the Indian Ocean. I know about them, even though I haven't been there. But I know about them. I hear about them. I read about them. But Sanji and I, whom I also know, but Sanji kind of grew up, in Dar es Salaam, was born in Dar es Salaam, grew up in Nairobi, is now in Canada. Look how many years he spent just writing about those experiences of growing up in those places. And then just recently he's discovered that he's an Indian when he visited India, and then realized, oh boy, this is home. So yeah, I think it plays a big part in understanding. But I suppose your question is also about the ocean. The ocean is like, how to put it? I don't have to see its hugeness. It's somehow, its hugeness is part of the way I think of these places. The really curious thing about being part of that littoral of the Indian Ocean is that I feel myself, and I think we all grew up feeling more connected to places like Somalia and Aden and Kerala, indeed, and Bombay, as it used to be in those days, and so then say somewhere like Madagascar, which is just across the road there, or Mauritius. These were unheard of places to us. We had nothing to do with them. because they're not part of that historical network.
Yeah.
And because the winds and the currents did not take us there, but they did take us back and forth to these other places. So the ocean is peculiarly both huge, but also kind of manageable as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abdulrazak. It's been a fascinating interview because I think there is a way in which through your novels, you got a sense of you as a person, and now meeting you, it's kind of confirmed, for me at least, it's been therapeutic in the sense that the way in which you handle vulnerabilities, the way you handle the uncertainties that lie at the heart of being a person, the fear of being misjudged, the idea of menace somehow lurking out there, and that we're all in some sense trying to make ourselves feel at ease in the world and at ease with ourselves. And there's a sensitivity and an empathy and a deep knowledge with which you write about these things, which I think is deeply comforting, right? At least for me. So thank you so much. And we look forward to reading more of your work and hopefully having you back again to talk about those. Nishat, would you like to say something before we hand over to Stephen?
Yes, we'll pass it to Stephen. But before that, I would second Dilip that, meeting you is a great experience. Of course, reading your writing has been a great experience. And for me, watching videos of some of your interviews, I could immediately connect with you when I saw you speaking. And today, when you speak to us, that has sort of reaffirmed that sense that one had got. So thank you so much. Thank you for all your generosity, and thank you, for speaking to us. In fact, I would share, because now we have almost ended. One of my friends had sort of shared that, it's very difficult to interview him. So be prepared. So, but thankfully, I did not find it difficult at all, and you have been so forthcoming. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll ask a few questions that are in the chat box. The first question is by me. What is the relationship you develop in your novels with a juxtaposition with roots and roots? The first one being ROU roots, and the second one being ROOTS.
Yeah, I know that formulation. Yeah. Well, I don't understand the question fully, but the relationship between roots is what we've been discussing, isn't it? There's sort of the interchange of cultures and so on. And I suppose roots meaning places of origin. Well, those places of origin are inescapable. There's not something that you can shrug off. They stay with you, and so you live. I suppose if you're certainly if you spend your time reflecting on these things, not everybody does. They have better things to do and move on. But if you're a writer, you reflect on these things all the time. And so roots is the kind of the hinterland, as it were, of your imagination. I don't know if I'm dealing with this question in a sensible way.
You did it. So the next question is by Grace Raju. She asks, as an author, do you think labels like world literature, post-colonial literatures, or writings from the global south are useful categorization? Would you call yourself as a post-colonial writer or writer from the global south?
I wouldn't call myself any of those things. I think they're useful for, because I've also been a teacher and an academic and so on. So I know the use of those terms. They're useful both as a way of organizing material. So, you're teaching certain books, and so it's a way of, having a way of handling them. They're also, I suppose, useful as simply giving a name to a category. So I have no problem. I have no problem with the use of those words from a discipline or from an academic point of view. But I don't need them for myself as a writer, as it were. I just write what interests me. I don't need to call it anything.
So the next question is, novelists are constantly engaging with the question of identity, home, migration, self, belongingness, while the dominant paradigm of the nation state is constantly engaged in creating more rules, regulation, defining the idea of citizenship, the legal human. My question is, what according to you is the potential of the faculty of storytelling? And second, what is the potential that exists in literature for people?
Yes, well, it's the very opposite of what you are describing as what the state does. It is indeed to point to detail, to distinctions, to difference. Not necessarily, it's not necessary again to give it a name like identity, because that's already to kind of to encapsulate it and make it into something manageable. But to be alert to differences, to details and so on, which obviously the state in the creation of its laws and so on is interested in homogenizing, in making something that will work for everybody.
The next question is by Dr. Shubhi Abedi. What is your take on Islamophobia and politics of...
Sorry, you're breaking up. Sorry. Can you say that again?
Yeah, I'll repeat that. It's by Dr. Shubhi Abedi. What is your take on Islamophobia and politics of misrecognition?
Yes, it's terrible. Of course, in the current world, as it were, that we live in, where religion, particularly the encounter of certain forms of Islamic ideology with the West in particular, has become, a dominant phenomenon. You see, it's easy to understand how certain state or cultural or indeed political groups would be happy to exploit this and see that the acts of groups of people who are driven by a very violent ideology actually represent everybody. So it's not sensible. It's like, I don't know, like saying gangsters are the United States or something like that. It's just not sensible to think that a small group of violent people then represents millions or billions or whatever.
Thank you so much, Professor Gurnah, for answering those toiling questions by our chairs and the audience, both. Okay. It was really persuading and stimulating to listen to such creative and insightful responses. I mean, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for your generosity and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gurnah. Your novels are impressive, and you are as impressive, if not more, than your novels. Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our audience for tuning in with us. And I really admire our chairs for their questions. Professor Menon with his puzzling rhetorical questions, and Professor Zaidi with those pertinent and perplexing questions. Thanks and cheers to you both for that. And thank you once again to all who have joined in.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thanks to Stephen and Grace.